Thank you all so much for coming. We're now ready to begin our first panel of the day. This panel is called To Protect and Serve the Militarization of Police. We're going to hear from the panelists, and then after that, we will have some time for some Q&A at the end. I'll be coming around and bringing this microphone to you all, so please be sure to raise your hand and let me know that you have a question, and I'll be happy to help accommodate you guys. I also want to let you know that this is being recorded. With that in mind, I do ask that you all silence your cell phones, but you don't need to turn them off. We do encourage you to utilize our social media. Our hashtag for this event is Advancing Justice, all one word. And you can also utilize our app to post to social media as well. And now I would like to introduce you all to our moderator of this session. From the Charles Koch Institute, Vice President of Research and Policy, William Ruger. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you. I know why the judge talked about these couches being really comfy. It seems like we should take a nap. No. So I'm really excited to have you all here for this panel. This is one of our key priority issues in the criminal justice and policing reform space, and so I'm really happy that we'll have a good turnout and a great panel. So let me introduce that panel first. In alphabetical order, Kara Dansky, to my left, is the founder and managing director of 1000 Arms. Dansky is a lawyer, policy analyst, and advocate with decades of experience in nonprofit and public sectors. She has previously been a special advisor at the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice in New York City, a senior counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union, where I got to know her, senior advisor at the Department of Homeland Security's Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, and executive director of the Criminal Justice Center at Stanford Law School. Before that, she was a public defender and a federal law clerk, and she received her law degree from the University of Pennsylvania and her Bachelor of Arts from the Johns Hopkins University. So welcome, Kara. Thank you. To her left, we have Ronald Hosko. He's the president of Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund. He worked for the Federal Bureau of Investigation for 30 years. He led the FBI's Crisis Management Unit in Quantico, Virginia, and served as the assistant special agent in charge in Philadelphia, where he was awarded the FBI's Shield of Bravery for his actions during a violent ransom kidnapping. After being promoted to the senior executive service, he led a seminal 20-year review of FBI shooting incidents, and he was then promoted to be a special agent in charge of the Washington Field Office's Criminal Division. Before he retired, he was asked to serve as assistant director of the Criminal Investigation Division, where he was responsible for overseeing the FBI's largest program. So welcome, Ron.
Thank you.
To my right is Peter Kraska. He's a professor and chair of graduate studies and research at the School of Justice Studies at Eastern Kentucky University. A lot of you in this space probably know of his work. He's been a leading scholar in the area of police and criminal justice militarization, criminal justice theory, and mixed methods research. I appreciate that last part as a social scientist. He has published 7 books, including Criminal Justice and Criminology Research Methods, Theorizing Criminal Justice, Militarizing the American Criminal Justice System, all great works. And his research has been published in a number of leading journals. He's also worked closely with over 60 different police agencies throughout the United States and recently testified on police militarization at the US Senate, which is a really good sign. Not only that they look to you, but they're interested in this subject. And then last but not least is Tim Lynch, who's a director on the project on criminal justice at the Cato Institute. Lynch's research includes the war on terror, overcriminalization, the drug war, the militarization of police tactics, and gun control. In 2000, he served on the National Committee to Prevent Wrongful Executions. Lynch has also filed several amicus briefs in the U.S. Supreme Court, and he's the editor of In the Name of Justice and After Prohibition. Lynch is a member of the Wisconsin, District of Columbia, and Supreme Court bars, and he's earned both a Bachelor of Science and a Juris Doctorate from Marquette University. So welcome, Tim. Great. Well, as you can see, we have quite a distinguished panel, great experts on this topic that have published a lot of interesting work and been working in this area for quite some time. So I'm going to really rely on them to drive this conversation. And we want this to be a real organic conversation. So I guess the first question, and I'll start with Kara, since she recently wrote a piece on the militarization of, or a report on the militarization of policing at the ACLU. What is this phenomena commonly referred to as the militarization of policing? What does this mean? Because there's all these words like community policing that have a variety of different definitions, or at least people think they do. So what does this mean? What does militarization of policing mean?
Thanks, Tim. So I think of the militarization of policing as comprising three factors: weapons, tactics, and culture. So when we talk about weapons, we're really talking about police use of weapons that either come from the Department of Defense through what is referred to as the 1033 program, or that police departments and other law enforcement agencies buy on the private market, often using money that they get from the federal government. So it's the use of essentially paramilitary weapons to conduct policing. It also comprises tactics. So here we're really talking about a number of tactics, I guess most commonly understood to be SWAT, Special Weapons and Tactics, which Dr. Kraska has done a lot of work on. At the ACLU, for the report that Will referred to, we did an investigation into police use of SWAT across the country, and we found that police often use SWAT teams predominantly to do drug investigations. We investigated a number of SWAT deployments across the country from hundreds of police departments and found that overwhelmingly police are using SWAT to conduct searches of people's homes, mostly for drugs. So we view that at the ACLU as a paramilitary approach to conducting the war on drugs. And then third, excuse me, I'm so sorry, I'm getting over a cold. Third is culture. And we've really seen over the course of the last several decades, at least at the state and local level, a shift in policing culture. And I would say that the militarization of police is the way that police today. And that has developed over the course of the last several decades, very much connected to the war on drugs. The 1033 program, which I referred to earlier, is a program that was initiated in the 1990s and authorizes the US Department of Defense to give military weapons to local police departments. And the law that created that program includes specific language around using the weapons and a preference for the use of the weapons to do counter-drug operations. So the militarization of police is very much connected to the war on drugs, which is a cultural phenomenon that, as everyone knows, has occurred over the course of the last several decades. So what I mean when I talk about police militarization is local law enforcement use of weapons, tactics, and a shift in culture that is extremely militaristic and results in a serious mistrust between police and the local communities that they serve.
Mm-hmm. Tim, you want to add to this?
Yes, I think Kara just made three important points, but before we kind of get down into some of the details, the militarization of policing, from my point of view, from a big picture standpoint, is two main trends going on. First of all, what Kara was talking about was we're seeing the civilian police departments beginning to adopt military-type tactics and the garb and weaponry that they are using. The second aspect of this trend is the military itself is becoming more and more involved in policing. So when we're talking about the US military interdicting ships in the Caribbean, Coast Guard vessels trying to stop smugglers, we're seeing two things going on. The military is getting involved in enforcing our domestic criminal laws more and more. And then, as I said, the civilian police departments are adopting the tactics of the military. So there's two trends going on, and I know the focus of this panel, I think, is going to be more on the civilian police departments.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Kraska, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I mean, we just refer to it as the criminal justice military blur, that the distinction, what we think of in a democracy, a clear distinction between internal security and external security, police and military, is blurring in significant ways, and we can talk about those ways that they're blurring. And I guess the important point is there ends up being a synergy that occurs both with the militarization of policing and the policization of the military. There's a synergy that occurs with them. So one of the things we found in our research is that a large percentage of local police departments actually train with active duty Navy SEALs and Army Ranger units. Well, on the surface of it, under the Department of Homeland Security, that sounds, wonderful. They call it cooperation and collaboration. But when you have local law enforcement officers getting training from Navy SEALs, and then they have to say, yeah, but we ignore the part when they say pull out the mortars and blow the place up. That's when that blur, you can tell, becomes pretty consequential.
Ron, do you have anything to add as far as our kind of definitional issues here from your background?
No, I think those are the high points. I think there is a historical perspective that we ought to be considering in this conversation. And going forward, I expect that we will see some significant continuity of this because of Operation Enduring Freedom, because of Desert Storm, where we did have, not only do you have people coming out of the military and joining law enforcement, but you also have collaboration overseas. And the FBI was part of that. DEA's been part of that over time. Other agencies at the federal level, where you have collaboration on intelligence. And you do have the tools of war being brought home domestically in ways that are important for our security.
Mm-hmm. Great. So that, I think, is a nice segue to a question about this area, which is this a big problem? I mean, we're trying to kind of define what it is, first of all, but is it a real problem? And if it is a real problem, how deep and widespread is it? In other words, is this something that only a few communities face, or are we seeing it across the country? So I guess the first question is this a big problem, and then how deep is it? Dr. Kraska?
Sure. In terms of it being a big problem, we have to look at what the consequences have been of police militarization. And so, as somebody mentioned earlier to me, Radley Balco's done some nice work documenting the large number of tragedies we've had as the result of no-knock and quick-knock drug raids, contraband raids on people's private residences. And our original research that was published in the late 1990s and then follow-up research has shown unequivocally trend lines that this is happening all over the country, in smaller communities and larger communities. Some people think, well, if a SWAT team is just a small unit and they're in a small department, what does it matter? Well, we have a police department near us that has 35 officers, and 15 of them serve on a SWAT team. Well, that's really important, as Kara said, from a cultural perspective, because that means you have 15 out of the 35 officers that are thinking in what's called a tactical way. Well, if they're policing that beautiful community in a tactical way, they're really missing the boat when it comes to what our police in a democracy should be doing. So I would argue it's widespread. And I guess one quick thing, I don't want to, as you can imagine, working on this for the last 30 years, I can talk a lot, but I won't. But it's also dispersed. We can't think of police militarization today as just SWAT teams. It is very much a part of the punitive turn in criminal justice and the punitive turn in policing and the punitive turn in the war on drugs. So it's not just SWAT teams. It's all of the things that are going on in policing now. I mean, a lot of police officers now carry what's called not a paramilitary weapon. They carry now what's called paratactical. Well, that's an example of how SWAT culture is trickling down into the rest of law enforcement. And they're thinking more in terms of really waging a war on crime.
Ron, from your background, how do you see the problem, or is it a problem at all in your view?
Well, I think that is a great question. Unquestionably, billions of dollars of federal excess property from DoD has been pushed out to local law enforcement organizations, state and federal as well. The additional agencies have gotten the Department of Homeland Security funding. So there are other mechanisms to get the gear in the hands and to train people in their proper use. However, I would disagree with Peter in this respect. So for about 8 years of my career, I was on 2 SWAT teams. And I never saw I saw that mission as being a very finite set of my daily duties. I was relatively seldom called upon. My daily duties involved investigating white-collar crime and violent crime. And I didn't see myself in the warrior mindset when I was building cases. There were times when we had SWAT call-outs and we had to do something that was particularly dangerous, and you start to think in a different way at that time. But I was not part of that mindset where I'm a warrior and I'm dealing with everybody as a warrior.
Now, are you seeing more of the younger police officers having a less bifurcated view than you did, where you had your regular job and your tactical moments? Do you see people thinking about their job as being kind of, tactical, militarized police officers?
Right. I think it's very situation dependent, and it's dependent too on the training and culture. And you referred to it or Kara did in the opening remarks. What's the culture of that particular police department? How are we raised as professionals to engage in our community? Mm-hmm. And so you could have SWAT teams, and most SWAT teams in America are part-time. This is very much of a part-time mission, called as needed. And then you go get your gear, the bat sign goes up, and you go get your gear and you put it on, and you respond to a specific incident. There are other departments that have components that are tactical heavy, that are they are the hammer, and they do see pieces of the community as the nail. And that is problematic. Mm-hmm. But I don't see that as systemic in law enforcement. I think it really depends on training, on professionalism, on culture within a department.
Kara, what do you think is how big do you think the problem is?
I think, I do think it's a problem culturally in the United States across the board. And I think many Americans sort of woke up to that after Ferguson or during Ferguson. And I totally agree that there's a tremendous amount of variation. We've got over 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the country, and they're not uniform, as Ron said. I think the variation manifests in really interesting ways, right? So I listened to the police commissioner in Washington, D.C. testify to her city council, and she said, and it's true, that they have a very limited SWAT deployment. And also, people in D.C. testify that they routinely experience police coming to their homes and knocking down their doors. It's just that it's not the SWAT team doing it, right? So there's militaristic activity happening often, but it's not being done by the SWAT team. So this can sometimes be really difficult to talk about because of the tremendous amount of variation. I also think it needs to be said that communities experience this in different ways, right? So what we found when we did the ACLU report was that, perhaps not surprisingly, Black and brown communities are overwhelmingly more likely to experience militarized policing than white communities. And I think that's very much connected to the war on drugs. So I do think it's pervasive, I do think it's systemic, and I think there's variation, and I think that it is particularly experienced by Black and brown communities.
Tim?
I agree that I think the problem is systemic and it runs deep because 2 primary things have happened. I mean, from your average layperson's point of view, they're aware that the FBI has SWAT teams. They're aware that the big cities have big city police departments like LA and New York City. They have SWAT teams. What most people are unaware of, but increasing recognition, as Kara said since Ferguson, is that SWAT teams are now in small town America. One of Peter's great articles is called The Militarization of Mayberry. Very small towns, and they've got paramilitary units. The second thing that has happened is when these units were initially created, the idea was there are going to be special situations that are beyond the capability of the ordinary patrolman. So we need the specialized units to handle those situations. But the second thing that has happened is mission creep, where they're not called out for the dangerous fugitive who's, you're never going to take me alive. I'm going to fight and shoot the police to the death. Their mission has expanded far beyond these dangerous situations where the police know in advance they're encountering a dangerous person. They're called out not on rare situations, more on routine calls, such as executing search warrants. So when you put those two things together, they're not in the big cities, just in the big cities, they're in small towns, and then they're not just called out for rare situations, but they're into more routine call-outs. You can see what some of us mean by it being, it runs deep, and it is systemic.
Yeah, I just saw an article this morning that talked about the militarization of the EPA.
It's another situation. We've got all these regulatory agencies in Washington that first acquire their own law enforcement units, where they have education department, Bureau of Land Management. They get a unit where some of their people are able to carry firearms and make arrests. And then the next thing that happens is then they create one of these specialized paramilitary units. Like you said, the EPA has one of them now.
Mm-hmm. Now, one question is how did we get here? I mean, given U.S. history and American liberal values, how did we get to a position where we have this phenomenon? So Radley Balko mentioned earlier a great book called Rise of the Warrior Cop. He asked a similar question, and I think it's worth reading this. He says, how did we evolve from a country whose founding statesmen were adamant about the dangers of armed, standing government forces, a country that enshrined the Fourth Amendment in the Bill of Rights and revered and protected the age-old notion that the home is a place of privacy and sanctuary, to a country where it has become acceptable for armed government agents dressed in battle garb to storm private homes in the middle of the night. So given where we came from in terms of our kind of broadly liberal society with a great fear of standing armies who noted the importance of privacy, how do we get to this position today where we see exactly what you're talking about, Tim? How did we get here? Peter?
Pick me.
Sure.
Pick me first.
Okay. I'm gonna go with Peter, and then we'll get to you.
Well, we have data that answers the question in terms of, not philosophically or theoretically, but just answers the question, what kicked this off? How did it start? It's very clear. And it was the middle 1980s to the late 1980s war on drugs. I mean, crystal clear. The trend lines all correspond perfectly. And that's when police departments started conducting upwards of 800 to 1,000 contraband raids on people's private residences a year. We have data that shows 800 to 1,000 contraband raids using a SWAT team, using the Navy SEALs model inside people's residences, not for murderers, not for barricaded suspects, but for, generally speaking, as the data shows again, low-level drug possession and dealing. So that's its origin. And of course, we also know that that drug war was waged predominantly against communities of color. And that's critical to recognize. And it's critical to connect that with Ferguson. Ferguson didn't just happen. This has been going on now for 25, 30 years in significant ways. Of course, we could connect it even farther back than that. So that's the gist of it. But we also have to remember that there was a monetary incentive as well. When I testified at the U.S. Senate, a high member of the National Tactical Officers Association pulled me to the side and he said, well, you know why all this contraband raid stuff started during the drug war? And I said, no, tell me. And he said, well, it's really because they found out that it was highly lucrative. That when you get inside people's residences and you can connect their assets with maybe some drugs in the place, then you can take those assets. And of course, the federal government then put out a dog and pony show where they went around the United States and they taught prosecutors and they taught local governments how to do asset forfeiture for a full decade. And that's all connected into the SWAT phenomenon as well. So yeah, it's cultural, but it's also, to some extent, economic.
He just mentioned just one quick point.
Sure.
He mentioned one thing quickly in passing. I want you to be aware of it. He mentioned the National Tactical Officers Association. This is a trade association in Washington, D.C. of tactical officers around the country. They have their own trade association.
40,000 members.
So when these issues come up in Washington, D.C., they've got lobbyists, like they want Congress to continue these programs and tactics. It's another indication of how entrenched this has become, that these units have their own trade association in Washington, D.C., I think.
Mm-hmm. Ron, and before you jump in here, I wonder if you could touch on some of maybe the well-intentioned aspects that got us to this situation, not just the kind of the bootlegger, quote-unquote, aspects.
Right, and I don't disagree with Peter on the incentivization piece of what he said, but I think it goes back a little further than the war on drugs. For those of us who can remember Charles Whitman in the clock tower at the University of Texas, a situation where he is with rifles a couple hundred feet in the air, gunning down people on this campus, and the police can't get to him to resolve the threat. The SLA shootout in Los Angeles in the 70s, where thousands of rounds were exchanged between this domestic terror group and Los Angeles Police Department. For the FBI, and this was a trigger for us in the late 80s, two FBI agents with a larger group of agents were following two suspected bank robbers. They were bank robbers. One of them was a former Special Forces operator in the military, and with handguns and a shotgun encountered these two men with high-powered weapons, and two agents, Ben Grogan and Jerry Dove, were gunned down that day. Another agent was grievously injured, and it started a conversation internal to the FBI that, of course, extends out about whether we are outgunned on the street. And as a young agent growing up, we knew we weren't ever going to be outgunned or outmanned or outplanned. But it started a conversation about our weapons and the capability of our weapons that resulted in bigger guns, right? We used 9 millimeters, well, we need 10 millimeters. And so, you know, we've all seen the video images of Columbine, right? We've all seen the video images of the bank robbery shootout, Bank of America in LA in 1997, where two people wearing body armor with automatic weapons laid siege to a police department. And now we have this active shooter phenomenon which impacts every little town in our country. So those images are powerful, and they are woven through this discussion, and certainly in the mind of any chief who knows that active shooter can be in his town today.
So Peter talked about this phenomenon known as policing for profit as being part of a driver. Carrie, you mentioned the 1033 program. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the kind of incentives that have promoted this, even aside from some of the things Ron talked about that might be more rational.
Yeah, so I think it's important to understand the billions and billions of dollars, literally cash, as well as billions of dollars worth of equipment that tens of thousands of local law enforcement agencies get from the federal government. So there's the 1033 program that Will just referred to. This is equipment going directly from the Defense Department to local law enforcement agencies for free, although local law enforcement is required to pay for transportation and maintenance, which is not insignificant because a lot of this equipment, maybe people have heard of MRAPs, mine-resistant ambush protected vehicles, massive tactical vehicles that many local law enforcement agencies are getting from the federal government, not inexpensive for local law enforcement agencies to maintain these. So that's one. The Department of Homeland Security has a program called the Homeland Security Grant Program that was initiated after 9/11 when the Department of Homeland Security was created, and it has sent billions and billions of dollars to local law enforcement agencies, which local law enforcement has used to buy on the private market, and maybe that's something else we could talk about, the private market as an incentive to buy these weapons. And then there's the Department of Justice's, what's referred to as the Burn JAG, Justice assistance grant program that local law enforcement agencies get. Local governments aren't required to spend all of the DOJ money on law enforcement, but they do spend the vast majority of money that they get from DOJ on law enforcement. And they use a lot of that money to buy paramilitary weapons. So I think it's really important to understand this issue of the federal government really incentivizing local law enforcement agencies to adopt these kinds of weapons and tactics.
Right, so it makes it harder for them to do the right thing, essentially. So, as people who think that this is a potential problem or a real problem today that may or may not be as widespread as some think, but I think it is quite widespread, what should the reform movement take from this discussion as far as where we need to go in order to learn more, to make the right kind of reforms and to move forward? I mean, in other words, are there studies? Is there data that's needed? What types of things do we need to learn in order for us to move forward? I mean, Peter, you're an academic. If you had a slew of research assistants or a slew of other academics working with you, what types of things would you be looking into, or what types of things need to be done?
My blunt, honest answer would be that this has devolved into a growth complex, and I work with it all the time. I see it firsthand, and I can't imagine what it would take to reverse the trend. And I know that's not very American to say. You know, we can always change it, we can always reverse it, we can always do something to tweak it and make it better. And certainly I can give you a glimmer of hope, and we'll give you some tangible things that can be done, but my overall assessment would be this is a juggernaut that's been developing not just since 9/11. This has been developing for 30, 35 years. And there are entrenched interests and entrenched economics and entrenched cultural factors that are going to make it very hard to do anything substantively.
Now, but on the research side, I want to press you here. Do we even know the scale of usage of SWAT teams? Do we need to have better data transparency? Is that something that academics could push for and make a lot of use out of?
So one of the things I've done at the local level is I'll get called into a state commission or to even just a local police department. They'll have some tragedy that occurred. I work for the Modesto, California Police Department, for example, when an 11-year-old boy was shot in the back by a SWAT officer after a home drug raid, and devastated the department, by the way. And they're trying to figure out what to do. And so, you know, there are absolutely all kinds of things that can be put in place. And one of them is clearly data collection. I mean, the Kentucky State Police for a long time period actually never allowed the media to show their faces on camera because they were such an elite, secretive unit. So imagine going to them and saying, we want your data for what you're doing in terms of deployments. You're not going to get it. And in fact, when we've tried to get it oftentimes, and I know Kara ran into this, you hear the Patriot Act, or you hear, you know, it's going to cost too much money to get this. So remember, we have to remember these are elite secretive teams. Also, the veil has been uncovered. So to get them to give you data is going to require an act of law. It's not going to be done voluntarily.
So Tim, as a policy analyst in Washington, what types of questions should academics be looking at so that you can better push forward on some of the things that Peter's talking about?
Well, first I have to underline this juggernaut point that Peter just made. What he's talking about is that most of the people are satisfied with the existing arrangement, okay? The people who manufacture all of this equipment, helmets, camouflage uniforms, flashbang grenades, these are private interests that want this stuff proliferating all across America. They want as many police departments as possible to have this stuff because it's in their private interest to do so. Members of Congress are happy to facilitate this transfer of weaponry and equipment from the Pentagon to their local police departments in their states. They're helping out the fellas. They get their pictures taken with this small town. They've just acquired an MRAP and all this equipment. So they feel like they're helping out their constituents. And then the police departments, they're receiving free goods. So they're happy. So that's the juggernaut that he's talking about. And it's gonna, I'm a little pessimistic too, because after Ferguson, we got the national media talking about this phenomenon and this trend, and yet very little happened. Obama issued an executive order, we're gonna tighten things up a little bit, but if that hasn't caused this thing to, to shake it and to stop it, we're kind of pessimistic as to what can. But at Cato, what I do is we talk about, if you want to see dramatic improvements, we have to end the drug war, like Peter was saying. If you want medium results, then you have to stop this flow of weaponry from the federal government to local police departments. Because if you're a police chief and you've got your budget and you're thinking about what to do next year, should I give the guys a raise? Should I hire two or three more police officers from my small town police department? Or should I buy an MRAP, a bunch of M16s, camouflage uniforms, and night vision goggles? If he had to spend his own money, they wouldn't be buying all that military stuff. Things would, shake out among themselves. But when you have the federal government with this flow, it distorts the decision making at the local level, and that's why they acquire this stuff. The second step is that if city councils were more involved in signing off on this stuff, that would put a brake on it as well. But we've got the police chiefs bypassing civilian oversight with like the city council, and they're talking directly to the Pentagon, and that facilitates the flow as well.
Right.
Neil, could I
Sure, Kara?
So one of the aspects of police militarization that I think doesn't often get talked about, and elaborating on what Tim just said, is the virtual, near total lack of accountability of police. So police departments across the country sometimes report to the mayor, sometimes report to city council. There's a lot of variation there as well. But for the most part, they are virtually unaccountable to anyone. And so it's exactly right what Tim just said, is that the police departments are talking directly to the Pentagon, directly to Homeland Security, directly to DOJ, and this results in an end run around local communities. So local communities have almost no say in how their police departments operate and how their police departments acquire these kinds of weapons and tactics. And so I think it's exactly right, and I'm very interested in this aspect of it. One of the President's task force recent recommendations is that before a police department can acquire equipment from DOD, there has to be some form of agreement or validation from their local governing body, whether that's city council or some other entity. And I think that's really interesting. And I think that this is one place, and it goes to your question, Will, about research, because as Peter said, it's extremely difficult to get data out of police departments, again, because they're not really accountable to anyone. A couple of states have enacted laws that require police departments to report on their SWAT activity, Utah and Maryland. This is a good development, and more state legislatures should do that. And also at the same time, I really think that this presents an opportunity for local communities, particularly communities of color, to demand that city council have more of a say in how their police departments acquire money and weapons and how their police departments operate.
Ron, shouldn't police officers be excited about greater transparency if they're doing the right thing? Is that something that we could kind of come together and stand together around, increasing transparency?
Yeah, it should be. And I agree with Kara that these questions and this sort of a forum shines a light on a concern. How big the concern is may depend on your community. But having accountability, having data that gets you to the conversation, so I know what equipment is there and how it's been used. And it could be, and I would suspect that there are hundreds of communities across America who have Humvees and high-wheeled vehicles and a command post vehicle that they got from the military, and they're using it for water rescues when their town floods, or they're using it for aerial surveillance when somebody is lost in the wilderness, and that there are very positive uses in many, many occasions, but we'll not know what the balance is without the data. So I think we do need data, and I think building in that transparency and accountability will raise the professionalism of those who are being unprofessional.
Right. Well, we only have about 1 minute left before we go to Q&A, but if you could give a kind of concise answer, all four of you, to this question, which is, and we talked a little bit about this last night at dinner, so we're almost kind of extending the conversation today. And unfortunately, you guys couldn't all be there with us because it was great. But if there was one reform that you could wave a magic wand and get, or one piece of data, or one model that would help your work, what would it be? Tim?
Well, I think collecting more data, is one of these small things that would be helpful. Of course, having more information is better than having less, but in this area, because of the juggernaut point I made earlier, I don't think it's going to change things. What is probably going to change these things is not like a big public debate. You're going to need a president and his attorney general and a secretary of defense who's as alarmed about this trend as we are, and they're going to kind of put a stop to it themselves, and kind of like, and at the local level, it's going to become, change the mindset of police chiefs who will reject these things, and city councils. It's going to be a long, hard slog rather than just one debate in the wake of another Ferguson, because I don't see that happening in legislators in Congress saying, oh my gosh, I didn't know this was happening and now we're going to stop it. I think we've just been through that and it didn't happen.
Okay. Peter?
We're not going to fix the problem by fixing the image of the police, which is what has always gone on in the past. Let's develop trust, let's develop legitimacy. That's not going to do anything for the problem, as if the activities are still taking place. So my real simple answer is divestment and decriminalization and ratcheting back this over-criminalization trend. The police are given the power that they have mostly due to the criminal law. And the criminal law system has to be reformed. Very simple little thing. I always bring into my classes the Kentucky Penal Code of statutes from 1960 to 1970 to 1980, and I line them all up. And of course, you can see the trend line just with the stack of statutes. Mm-hmm. And it's, Jonathan Simon calls it governing through crime. And we have devolved into a society that now governs through crime. And this is one of the reasons why it's so central, I think, to the Koch Institute, because they see that as a distortion. That's not how we should be governing a democracy. Mm-hmm. So divestment and decriminalization.
Great. Kara?
Unfortunately, I think there isn't one.
Yeah.
I think there's far too much complexity at the federal level in terms of the 3 programs we talked about. There are laws that Congress would have to change, which I'm not too optimistic about. There's too much complexity at the state level. There's too much variation at the local level. There's too much variation in terms of different kinds of communities and how communities are policed. There's too much of the entrenchment of the culture of militarization. So I think, I agree with what Tim and Peter both said. It's going to be a long haul, and there's a lot of work to do.
So it seems like what you're telling us is that if we're going to have any sense of optimism here, it has to be about the creation of ideas and research in order to help us shine a light on this, to help change the culture, so that then policymakers have to take this seriously. Is that some shred of hope there?
I mean, I don't think it's hopeless. I think we're in a moment of hope. I mean, I think we're in a moment where people are really paying attention to this issue. And I think we have to seize the opportunity to do whatever we can. I just don't think there's one silver bullet.
No doubt. Ron, what would be one thing that could help in terms of an incremental fashion? Because of course it's climbing Mount Everest to do the whole thing. But is there something that can help us get over the next hill to improve the situation?
To me, it's data collection, because data collection gives you better analysis. If without it, we are analyzing anecdotes. We don't know how many good, how many bad. All we have is yesterday's rumor that I heard. And it involves all segments of our community. It involves the community. It involves the judiciary, the judges, the magistrates who are approving a search warrant on a drug house with no probable cause. How many times did you do that this week? How many times did you sign a blank document and let the police go do something bad? Accountability. Builds it in at every level of government.
Great. So now let's open it up to the floor here so that we can continue the conversation. And please.
All right, thank you. You mentioned Obama's executive order recently, and just last week in a Texas newspaper, it was reported, and this, as first I'd seen of it, and y'all didn't mention it, just real quick. As part of President Obama's executive order issued earlier this year, local law enforcement agencies with certain types of military-style gear obtained through the federal 1033 program are being required to return the equipment, including armored vehicles, bayonets, grenade launchers, large caliber weapons. And the sheriff in Midland, Texas, who was complaining about this and where the local article came from, was going to have to return 2 of his 3 MRAPs. He was complaining that the other one he'd bought with Homeland Security funds, but he'd gotten 2 of them free through the 1033 program, and he's having to give them back. So are other people having to give them back? How big a recall is this? What's going on with the executive order?
When I told, I was on C-SPAN's Washington Journal, and she was asking me about Obama's executive order, and I started to explain the restrictions, and I mentioned bayonets and grenade launchers, and you know, normally on C-SPAN they're very neutral and calm, and she burst out laughing, saying, "What possible use could the police have for bayonets and grenade launchers?" And I said, this is some of the stuff that is flowing from the Pentagon to the police departments. So yes, some of the departments around the country are beginning to return some of these things. I don't think the chief should be complaining about returning grenade launchers. I mean, it's fun stuff that they like to have and maybe use out for training or to play around with, but it's not necessary for their police mission. And we'll have to see to what extent other departments are complying with this order. We'll probably have reports in a year or 2 that some are doing exactly, you know, following the strictly and the returning. Others are not, and we'll try to get some attention to that. But that's how I see things panning out with that.
I actually, just real quick, I actually worked on that commission that came up with those recommendations, and I was just blown away. I'll just be blunt. I was blown away with how ridiculous those recommendations were. Not one of them, and I said this to the Guardian journalist, and he did a full piece just on the scam that was those provisions. And of course, that's why I've not been invited back to the White House. And you know, every single one of them was just ridiculous. And I'll just give you one quick example. You can't have armored personnel carrier vehicles or Humvees with tracks. Well, no police department in the country wants, unless they're really out there, wants a track vehicle. So I mean, they were just silly. And it was a great example of, in academia, what we call symbolic politics.
Mm-hmm. So we have another question over here, the woman right here. Could you repeat that in the microphone? I think that's important.
Yes, I had my home raided in Los Angeles in 1991, and although they weren't wearing black at that time, in fact, they were wearing cowboy hats because they were from Texas. They rushed me when I pulled into the garage, guns, screaming, chaos. Ironically, they screamed, "Don't move and put your hands up." So I'm, you know. And has somebody who's gone through that where they pull you from the car, take you into your home, throw you in a seat, and the lack of professionalism and degradation that's going on where your everything is being thrown in the floor in your kitchen, my front door was in the floor, you're in shock. You're in absolute shock. And then they throw you in a seat and they start threatening you with, "We can indict you for conspiracy unless you will cooperate with us." My husband had been arrested in Germany for ecstasy, and we were separated. But I went through this process of holes being punched into the walls of my home, and I don't know who thinks that that is an appropriate or professional way of dealing with American citizens. I would not cooperate. 2 years later, I was dragged to Waco, Texas, and went to trial, and you're penalized if you go to trial. My husband cooperated, got 3 years probation, and he was the kingpin. I got 24 years based on all the ecstasy he had manufactured, because you're guilty for everything that goes on in a conspiracy. My question is, when you have a murder case, there seems to be more professionalism in a murder case where people tape off a crime scene and they do things sort of methodically. And in a drug case, the screaming, the throwing all of your kitchen items in the floor, I don't know what purpose that serves, and I think it's a horrible testament. Jack Cole, who's with co-founder of LEAP, I'm sorry, I know I'm in a narrative, but my question is this. He told me that when in the 70s he was an undercover narc, that they didn't have drug rates gone bad during that time because they had to go into the home, they had to do a couple of buys, they had to wear a wire, they had to know that that home was really a home where drugs were being sold. Now we're in a model where on the tip of an informant, you bust into a home in the middle of the night. Why can't we go back to that different model where you actually know that there's drugs being sold in the home?
So Ron, what's gone wrong here? Why can't we go back to that?
Well, 18,000 police departments across America, all going to thousands of different magistrates. What's acceptable in one area of the country may be totally different in another, and one level of government may be totally different from another. It is the difficulty of bringing one standard across America, despite the fact that the standard ought to be the Fourth Amendment of the of our Constitution. So, how do we get to that point? I don't know how we do it. And stories like this are a tale of lack of professionalism. You wonder how a warrant gets issued and how these activities, and why there might be no accountability for that after the fact.
Right. Kara, quickly?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, the Supreme Court over the course of the 80s and 90s really did some work on the Fourth Amendment. I used to clerk at the Federal Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, and I once heard a federal appellate judge say, essentially today, the Fourth Amendment is just a placeholder between the Third and the Fifth. There's a lot of work to be done in the judiciary.
Yeah. Last question in the back.
This is a difficult question to frame. I'm going to try to do it. But from a libertarian perspective, let's go to the deep culture and also within the federal framework. I'm somewhat uncomfortable with criticism of the demilitarization of local law enforcement, but not addressing the militarization of the federal agencies, the government and such. So when you consider the spectrum and deep culture of law enforcement officials, especially the cop on the street, is there any empirical evidence that should a tug come, like on the Bundy Ranch episode, that the local law enforcement, highly militarized, no doubt about that their loyalties are more with the local, state communities as opposed to a command and control from the central authority? And if so, isn't that sort of a silver lining of the cloud that the local communities do have some defense against the over-militarized federal government?
That's interesting. Pete?
Yeah, it's a strange thing to bring up because everyone wants to forget about this, and I know it's a trigger for a lot of people. But in the midst of all my research, heavily into my research, Waco and Ruby Ridge transpired. And not so much Ruby Ridge, but at least in Waco, I was watching unfolding the blurring distinction of the military and police right before my eyes in a horrendous tragedy, all being conducted by extremely well-trained people, not hacks, the elite of the elite, doing some incredibly stupid, injurious things to American citizens. And of course, the blowback that came from Waco was extreme. And it's really an important point that at the federal level, these things have been going on for a long time. And at the federal level, there's been a lot of, as we talked about already, incentivization. But we have to remember that at the heart of things, our police institution is inevitably militaristic. It's inevitably militaristic. We just have to ask, to what degree do we want it to be militarized? Do we want it to be here, or do we want it to be as little as possible?
So does this mean that we actually, it's not just data for econometricians to crunch, but do we really need to see philosophers and political scientists stepping
Absolutely.
into this as well?
Absolutely. This should be a values-driven argument as much as a social science data argument, because there's some really important principles at stake here, and those aren't talked about enough.
Well, hopefully this won't be the end of this conversation, that we'll take this outside of these walls and really bring it back to our universities, think tanks, and capitals. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Nice job.